Welcome back, friends, to the Lemon Star Quilt Part 2. This video is a continuation of a quilt that I'm making for a friend. If you haven't seen it already, I'll put the link to the Part 1 video in the description box. Moving forward where I left off with Part 1, I have the fabric for the backing and the binding right here. I went ahead and cut out 2.5-inch strips for the binding with my rotary cutter. I also cut out 2-inch strips to make a 1.5-inch strip border on the front. Then I cut out 4.5-inch strips out of the yellow material that I have for the backing to make a 4-inch border on the front. If you saw the first video, then you'll know that I made a lot of these half-square triangles that didn't fulfill the right measurement. So I am going to use 4 of them in each corner of the 4-inch yellow border to make a windmill design. I trim them up to be 2.5 inches square. I start by sewing 2 half-square triangles together, and here's what it looks like. Then I sewed 2 more together, and then sewed the 2 sets together to create 4 half-square triangles in a block to make a windmill pattern. When I'm done with it, it turns out to be 4.5 inches square. And voila, I made 4 of these. I'm joining the 2.5-inch strips to make the binding. I put the fabric right sides facing, and they are perpendicular to each other. And now I am making this seam that is going diagonally down the strips. I always check the seam after I sew it when I'm making binding to make sure the fabric edges align with one another. And this one looks pretty good, so I can go ahead and trim off the excess fabric. If I had to take out the stitching and redo the seam, it would be a lot easier to do it with that excess fabric on it. So that's why I always check first. Now I'm joining the thinner strips, the 2-inch strips that I'm going to use as a border. So now I am matching the strips to the side of the quilt, and I will sew the sides on first and then do the top and the bottom. The length on the sides for the skinny borders are 53 inches. 41 3/4 inches for the width of the top and the bottom. And I just want to make a note that for the binding, I folded it in half vertically, ironed it, and then folded it neatly to keep it for when I need it. Now back to the skinny border. With the skinny border on all 4 sides, I can now put the 4-inch yellow border on the sides. And that measures 56.5 inches in length. It's actually a 4.5-inch border, as I've allowed for a 1/4 inch seam allowance on each side, but it will be 4 inches when finished. The windmill blocks are going into the corners, and so they need to be sewn onto the ends of the top and the bottom large border. The width of the 4.5 inch yellow border between the two windmill pattern blocks is 42 3/4 inches. So the windmill blocks get sewn in the corners of the top and bottom pieces. I'm ready to sew the large border onto the top and bottom of the quilt, and so I prepare by lining up the seams and pinning them so that they're nesting nice and snug, and then I can go ahead and sew the border onto the top. Since I'm sewing on a border piece with 2 corner pieces to it, then I only have 2 seams that I have to line up. And here it is with the corner pieces and borders on it. There wasn't as much contrast between the skinny border and the thicker border as I thought there was going to be, but I think it will be okay. I'm not going to rip anything out and start over. So I'm still learning about colors and fabrics and contrast and shades and hues and all of that. My larger border is the same fabric as I'd planned on using for the backing. And I thought I had carefully figured out that I would have enough for the backing with using the fabric for the border as well. But I've come up short with the measurement for the fabric on the back that I need. So I am trying to create a different design for the back. And instead of the straight yellow with white daisy fabric on the back as I had planned, I am going to use some of those, or maybe all of them, the half square triangles that I made that didn't fit into the design on the front. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, you may want to go back and watch the first video to this quilt. So right now I'm just squaring up these half square triangles to be 3 inches square. Next, I'm sewing 2 half square triangles together. And then I sew 2 more together. Then I match up the seams so they're nesting and sew both sets together. And voila, another windmill block, only slightly larger than the ones in the corners on the front. The finished block is 5.5 inches square. I decided to alternate the windmill blocks with 5.5-inch squares. So here I am sewing on a windmill block with a plain 5.5-inch square of yellow printed fabric. And here it is laid out after I started sewing some of the blocks together. And now, after several sections have been sewn together, I'm sewing the 2 big sections that I have together now. And going back over this now, I can't believe that I didn't see that I was making a mistake as I was making it. It's almost too painful to watch. So yeah, I picked the seam apart, turned it around, and redid it. It's just not a good quilt unless you make 1 or 2 big mistakes. I got a cereal box and cut it down to use the cardboard to make a template for the pattern that I'm going to draw on the top of the quilt. So I had a lid from my Tupperware cabinet, drew a circle, and then cut out the circle. That is roughly 6 inches in diameter. If I had really known what I was doing, I would have cut out the circle to be the same diameter as the squares of the pattern of the quilt. But I didn't, so I'm just going to go for it anyway. I really like using friction pens to mark the patterns on my quilts, but I have a problem with them drying out because the cap splits and breaks and they dry out. So I'm going to try using chalk pencils this time. And here I folded the quilt top into quarters so that I could mark the middle of the quilt top. And I'm using the darkest chalk pencil that was in that package. It was a charcoal color, and I marked the middle. There it is. Can you see it? I watched a video showing how to make the orange peel quilt pattern on YouTube, and I'll put that link in the description box. Anyway, it said to divide or to make lines in squares so that you could put your template in the middle of the box. And so I started out making lines 6 inches apart. This is the first circle I made, and I made it so that that mark that marked the middle of the quilt was in the middle of the circle. So going back to the lines that I drew on the quilt, and I only did that a couple of times and I kind of scrapped that idea and then just started transferring and making the circles right next to each other. Just make sure that the lines of the circles next to each other match up so that there's no gaps. I did have a few gaps, but I didn't redo it. Here I am marking it into quarters, and I'll show you why in a little bit, but I ended up not doing that on each one either, so you can do what you want to do, be as particular as you want to be about this, I guess. The quarter lines that I drew are to help you, if you have corresponding quarter lines on the template, they're to help you when you draw a circle around connecting all 4 intersections or 4 circles together. So there is a circle there, you can see it, connecting the circles. So I don't know if I mentioned it before or not, but the pattern that I'm making for the stitching lines is called the orange peel pattern, and the pattern that I made to piece the quilt together is called the Lemon Star pattern. So I thought that was kind of funny. We've got a real citrus theme going here. This is the rope design that I just did by freehand on the skinny border. It was pretty easy to do. If you save those little cardboard pieces that come in the fat quarters, then you can use them to make templates later on. I just made a simple flower design by using a cup as my guide to make a circle first, and then added petals to it. It ended up being too big, and so I did pare it down and then cut the design out. So I am tracing out flowers and leaves now on the 4-inch border, and I'm going rogue. I don't have a pattern. I am just doing it as I go and how I feel. I'm sewing on the back pieces that I have to piece it together for a backing. So I start with the 4-inch wide length of fabric that I have to stitch to the top of the pieced piece. I stitched another 4-inch length on top of that piece. I had a length of 22 inches and I cut that in half, and I sewed a one piece onto the bottom of the pinwheel pieced piece, and then sewed the other piece onto the bottom of that. So by sewing all of those pieces together, I was able to get a piece of fabric large enough for the backing. And here it is laid out on my bed. I laid the top piece on top of it just to make sure that it was large enough. And then everything was ready for me to lay it out on the floor and sandwich the quilt together with batting in between. With the backing laid wrong side up, you can really see how I stitched all of those remnant pieces together to get a full piece for the back. I like to lay the backing down on the floor and tape one side and then pull it taut and tape all around so that it's taut and smooth. On this day, I taped part of it with masking tape and then went to go find the pins and misplaced my tape somewhere, so had to end up using Scotch tape to finish it off, which isn't as good as masking tape, but it worked in a pinch. I then laid the batting on top of that layer and smoothed it out the best that I could and trimmed off the overhanging pieces. Here's the necessary picture of a dog standing on a quilt that I'm trying to work on. In this picture, you can see the difference in the whiteness of the two white fabrics that I used, and I hadn't noticed it before then. After I laid the top piece on top of the batting and the backing, I smoothed it out and then pinned the 3 layers together with safety pins, and I didn't get a picture of that. I'm going to be using a hoop to smooth out the fabric so that I can stitch it by hand. Since I am going to stitch it by hand, it's going to take me a while to finish this off. So I am going to close this video here, and I will follow up with the 3rd video once I've finished with the stitching and show the binding and the finished quilt. I'll leave the links for the other videos connected with this quilt in the description box. This has been a long process, and some people might think that it's just too much fussing, that it's just too much work for them to do. But it's like any interest or hobby that someone may have. If you enjoy doing it, then you're willing to put the time into it that it requires. So thanks for joining me, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.